Interviewee will be with Dr. Jos Boys. She is the director of the Learning Environments Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Center at the Bartlett UCL. She was a co-founder of Matrix Feminist Design Collective in the 1980s and of the DisOrdinary Architecture Project with disabled artist Zoe Partington in 2008. Jos is author of Doing Disability Differently, an alternative handbook on architecture, disability and designing for everyday life, and also editor of Disability Space Architecture, a reader. Her work is at the forefront of inclusive design in the built environment and provides a vital critique of how we view disability today. Jos will be interviewed by Sharon and Derin Fadina. Thank you, sorry.
Thank you, Mahika. Okay, my name is Derin. I am a West African cisgendered male. I'm wearing a mostly black outfit, even though it's like 27 degrees outside. And I tell people I'm 6 foot, so that is what it is.
Hello, I'm Sharon. I'm short by London standards, but in Hong Kong, where I'm from, I'm actually medium height. I'm wearing an orange skirt that I can't walk that well in, and I have black hair, but I'm starting to get some white hairs, so yep. And with that, we'll get into the questions, I think. So we have Jos Boys with us, and hi Jos. So to start things off, you wrote a great article. Oh yeah, Jos, would you like to introduce?
Sure, and it's a good way of doing a sound check too. I'm a white woman in her 60s. I've got glasses and I've got short black and white, black and grey streaked hair.
Awesome, thank you, Jos. So yeah, we'll get into the questions now, which are kind of a pick and mix of your very broad work experience. So first of all, you wrote a great article for the Funambulist titled The DisOrdinary Architecture Project, a handy guide for doing disability different in architecture and urban design. And this article broke down 7 assumed problems and then the 7 actual problems, which I thought was a really great and effective way of understanding the ethos of disordinary architecture. But meanwhile, the majority of architecture firms out there, they are making the assumptions you highlight, and not even actively, but just sort of not even thinking about disability in a very effective way. And for a lot of firms, I think accessibility just means bringing out that building code PDF every now and then drawing those dashed squares at the certain size and then ticking off those boxes. So with that in mind, sort of big picture, could you touch a bit more on some of these assumptions and what designers are doing incorrectly and approaching disability?
Sure. I mean, I think especially following on from Nabil and Belinda, I think it's really, I really need to start from explaining why I wrote the handy guide, why I wrote it in that way. And that comes as somebody who's the only non-disabled and only architect trained person in DisOrdinary Architecture Project. So I think that my role in that group, which started, as you said, sort of 2008, and brings together a really interesting and diverse range of disabled artists and increasingly architects and designers to explore really different ways of thinking about disability within the architecture, built environment, professions and in education. So for me, there's kind of 2 aspects to that really. One is as a middle-class white woman, it felt really important to kind of try and amplify and make space for the extraordinarily brilliant creative work in disability studies, scholarship in disability activism, in disability art practice, creative practice, which has been going on for an incredible amount of time. I mean, just as with the civil rights movements around race and around feminism, similar campaigns have been going on around disability for a very long time. They just seem to be somehow not taken much notice of. So it became, first of all, really important to learn from those already existing activities and to work with people in collaborate in new and interesting ways. And really everything in the Funambulist article and in other things that I've written comes from that experience. It comes from working slowly but surely, you know, over nearly 15 years now with a group of mainly probably about 25 disabled artists, very talented disabled artists, but also a wider number of people, kind of allies and other kinds of practitioners. And then the second part of that is, besides kind of amplifying those voices and working with people to try and together rethink why we do it so badly in architecture, is that I do have, because I studied architecture, I have a knowledge of and a critique around how architecture works, how it gets inculcated through education and practice in particular ways and not others. And so what I can do is kind of work both ways and be able to talk through and think through what it is that are actually these underlying problems for architecture in the wider sense, not just in, you know, the way that spaces get designed, but in also in the kind of modes of practice that we use and the ways that we continue educating generation after generation. So for me, you know, if we're talking about what the key points are, two of them are very directly about how we think about disability in architecture. First of all, we have this really strange thing that we do where we do a design project. I'm talking, you know, specifically about designers, but obviously other people involved too, like clients and users. We do a design where we design for quote unquote everybody, which turns out to just be normal people. And then right at the end, there are a whole gang of people we've already excluded, disabled people. And so we kind of fit them in. We kind of add on the bits and pieces that might make functional bits and pieces that might make built space work better. And some of those work, but really it's a kind of crazy way round. It's kind of extraordinary that we go on doing that and aren't surprised and confused and upset by the fact that we go on doing that, because it's very discriminatory. And the second aspect of that, I think, and I'd be really interested in people's opinions in both in the room and online, is disability is still treated very much as a kind of ahistorical, atheoretical subject, as if disabled people and disability as a concept don't have anything creative to bring to architectural education and practice. So it's treated very functionally. You know, we may, I'm not saying we do it very well, but we do talk about gender, we do talk about race, we do talk about class, but actually somehow we talk about sexuality. We don't, as I say, we don't necessarily do those things very well, but when it comes to disability, it's somehow parked somewhere completely different. And it goes on being weird for me. And then the other two things, just to finish off on this, is if those are about how the profession, how the discipline doesn't think about, only thinks about disability in a very limited way. I think the other thing is the nature of architecture itself and the related built environment disciplines, because there are a whole set of disciplinary norms around, you know, that you have no time for reflection. Once you're in practice, you just need a soundbite. You just need that template. You don't have time to think about it. You want some sort of insta guide, some insta technical solution. And that means that these things just don't improve. They don't move on. And that means that we reproduce through those conventional design practices, including the kind of design methods that we use, we produce spaces that enable some and disable others. And that's not just around disability. That's all sorts of other ways in which people are disabled by built space.
Excellent. Thank you, Jos, for that answer. Yeah, I agree entirely about the pertinence of embedding issues of disability much earlier in the design process in a very genuine, rather than just a box ticking sort of way. at the risk of this feeling like a non sequitur, I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I'd like to talk about your work with Matrix, especially because I think recently it's having a bit of a resurgence. Obviously, there was that exhibition at the Barbican late last year, and it's coming up a lot in symposia such as this and in general discourse. And so I wondered if you could contextualize this renewed interest in the work of Matrix in many of the shifts in practice that we're seeing today. So I'll give an example. We see sort of increases in sort of grassroots collectives forming, and on the other hand, we see a lot of talk about kind of scrutinizing exploitative labor practices and sort of increased calls for unionization as well. And so I wonder if you, I suppose the question is, do you see much of the work that Matrix was doing, which was very much in the same vein? Do you see Matrix as offering a sort of blueprint for some of these emerging practices and shifts that I just outlined?
I think you're absolutely right about the kind of emerging shifts that are happening in the current moment, and they're very it's very exciting to see them and see a lot of overlaps and connections, which I think has meant that people have looked back to Matrix as well as to other kind of community-based collectives from the 1970s and 80s and 90s. And I suppose the thing that I would say is, I mean, what's interesting is that notion of blueprints, that I think one of the things we try and spend a lot of time when we talk about Matrix is that it's not in any way foundational. You know, it's not any more special or different to what's going on now. It's just that the circumstances were different, and some of the things that we focused on were different, and some of those things we perhaps, I feel like a lot has been learned since. So it's a kind of backwards and forwards, I think. And there are things that we, you know, Matrix in terms of the practice, you know, had some things where it did, everybody was paid the same, and it worked with collective decision making, but at the same time, it had quite a confused set of ideas about, if you think about access needs in the widest way. So it kind of focused on childcare needs as an access need that was acceptable, but it didn't necessarily focus on the needs of, for example, the lesbians in the group. So there were kind of, or women with on very low incomes who would struggle to work on the, if everybody was on paid the same. So there's a lot of things, I think, you know, it's about raising those kinds of discussions and just continuing those conversations about what is where, and I think the gaps and opportunities are in different places now to where they were in you know, a very derelict 70s London, where you could squat, you could live very cheaply. It's a very different, and you know, the local authority was funding projects. It was a very different place. So, but I think the conversations, you know, it's rich to have those conversations.
Thank you, Jos. And again, another perhaps non sequitur, but to jump back to present day, of course, we're still living through the pandemic. And in 2020, you did a workshop at the Universität der Künste in Berlin, which took the disruptive effects of the pandemic as a way of engaging with difference. And students responded to how hard it was just to go to the park, go to the shops, find a place to have online meetings. And these are things that you say all require creative skills in navigation and negotiation and expertise that many disabled people would say they already have just by living in the quote unquote normal world. So since pretty much everyone went through the pandemic and had their own quote unquote normal lives shifted, yeah, can you speak about how the pandemic has sort of had an effect on the wider public and the wider field of design in terms of interest and feelings towards alternative approaches to design?
That's a really great question, and I'm not sure I'm the person to answer it. I think that the way that various publics have, you know, I don't know that there's one public, and I think the various publics, the way that different people have been affected by the pandemic is very wide-ranging and has had a whole number of really interesting and very nuanced effects. And as you said, I think for a lot of disabled people, they kind of found it both frustrating that things were happening, that things were enabled, like being able to attend meetings online that had not been allowed pre-pandemic for them, were enabled as soon as there was something that non-disabled people needed. So there's a set of ways of thinking back over that and thinking about the ways in which power relations and social relations played out. I think for me, the big thing is we use in DisOrdinary Architecture, we use the notion of breaching a lot. And that means we talk about everyday social practices and architectural and design practices. So what is the everyday that's so sort of obvious that nobody notices it? And I think, and breaching is where you deliberately and creatively play around with that normative behavior. And we do a lot of projects and workshops where we use this notion of breaching in DisOrdinary. And I think that what was brilliant with the FemArch work was because the students had all, without meaning to, had their lives breached, they developed some really interesting design projects that were very, very different to anything they might have done in a different circumstance. And for me, that's the important thing to learn really, is that a kind of creative breaching is a very offers a way into all sorts of different alternatives, I think.
Should have done that off mic, sorry. Thanks a lot, Jos. Okay, I pulled up a quote here from an interview you did with the RIBA Journal, and you're sort of commenting on inclusivity and accessibility in architecture. You liken it to the Black Lives Matter movement, and this is the quote here. You said, "There won't be proper change until the people with privilege recognize that they are part of the problem and start to take a position of solidarity." And then you add that they need to not leave it up to the people who have been othered. And obviously, solidarity is a concept I think that we've all been grappling with, at least in the last few years more recently. So I thought, in maybe in a slightly open-ended way, and maybe as a way of sort of ending the conversation, I wanted to get your thoughts on essentially what this sort of solidarity looks like in your area of work.
Yeah, that's such a big question, and also always it's always a work in progress really for everybody, I think. And I guess again, I have to talk about some of the lessons we've kind of developed in the DisOrdinary Architecture Project and how that affects me in particular as a non-disabled person who's aiming predominantly to speak to other non-disabled people and to get them to rethink what assumptions they have about disability. So I think one of the things that comes up, the most immediate thing, is really to think of architecture as a embodied practice. It sounds, and a lot of the work that we do explores what that might mean. If for people in the room who've studied the subject or work as an architect, there's still a kind of notion of a kind of professional, neutral professional who just tries to make the best balanced and compromise, makes the best decisions that are balanced. And what that does is not challenge in any way the kind of normativity of what constitutes balance and whose balance it is. So, and the question I get asked most often is by non-disabled people is, it makes me feel really awkward and uncomfortable talking to a disabled person, a visibly disabled person. I don't know what to do. I think I might say the wrong thing. And I think that, there's some really basic behaviors that we all need to develop around how we learn to see people and not the color of the skin, or whether they're male or female, or non-binary, or whether they're disabled. So, I still have colleagues at work who can't talk to me about anything except what their wives are doing because I'm female. They can't see beyond the fact that I'm female, which is kind of really peculiar to me. And the similar things happen, we all know these experiences if we are in some quote unquote position of otherness, although we may also ourselves do it to other people. So there's some really essential things there, I think. And I guess for me, yeah, things like Black Lives Matter, which are kind of flipping that on to the people with privilege. And also, you know, I think a lot of the gender fluid, non-binary movement's it's fantastically powerful, because it's basically trying to say, whatever, you know, that you shouldn't, we have to stop reading off people's appearance something about their rights to be in the world and their rights to be, you know, to behave in the world in a particular way. So I think there's a whole set of things going on at that level of everyday practice, whether it's just as you're in the street or whether it's when you're in your employment. And we really need to, solidarity for me is finding all sorts of ways to open up rather than close down the rich variety of our neuro and biodiversity. I think we do too much, we don't even notice that we do it. We do a lot of everyday policing. You know, if you talk to any disabled person, they will give you stories about how they've been policed, whether it's acceptable that they use an accessible toilet, for example, or, you know, whether they're using a parking space when they shouldn't. So there's a whole set of things just in everyday life that we could be doing, which I think is about solidarity. And then I guess, I mean, it's interesting, I kind of avoid terms like inclusion and accessibility, and it's not because they're wrong, but because there's a whole set of terms, and empathy is a really big one. There's a whole set of, in language, there's a whole set of words that we use that perpetuate a thing, which is the person with the privilege doesn't have to change. I'm here, I give you access, I let you in, I include you in my world, please come in. When I get round to it, you can come in. But I don't have to change at all. And the same with empathy. Empathy is like, I care for you, tell me your terrible story. It's not about the problem of the person who's created that situation of non-empathy in the first place. So I guess all these are very general things about solidarity. For me, they are, but if we start using words like social and spatial and material justice, which is what disability activists and scholars use, and artists often, and move away from access and inclusion or empathy, we move towards something which really recognizes power relationships. And that's the job of anybody who's trying to have solidarity in this field, is to unravel the power relationships.
That's amazing. Thank you very much, Jos. I think we'll end there. I should add an extra. Yeah, sorry. Just to say an extra thank you to Jos, because she can join us in person because she has COVID. So it's very gracious of you to still attend even though you're in recovery. We appreciate it very much. Thanks a lot.